it's all good that it's come more towards the left wing. Commissioner Parry and I knew that it would over time. You know,
Right.
it would move, the centre of the commission would move in our direction, right?
Right.
We would finally be the ones, you know.
Yeah, well, it all depends which side you're sitting on, whether it's the left or the
Far
right.
left wing, you know.
the progressive and the conservative.
Yeah, you right-wingers over there.
Right. All right. So I'd like to call this meeting to order. This is the January 9th, 2019 meeting of the Planning Commission. It's our first meeting of the year. And could we have the Pledge of Allegiance? And let's have Jason. Welcome back, Jason. Lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, roll call.
Commissioner Landris? Here. Commissioner McKinnon?
Present.
Commissioner Perry?
Here.
And Chair Fodder.
Here. Okay, Planning Director's report.
Good evening, Commission. Coming up at your next meeting, which is just next week on January 16th, we have a alcohol CUP at 3001 Santa Monica Boulevard. We have a couple of vesting tentative track maps for projects that the Commission approved a few months ago at 2225 Broadway and 1450 Cloverfield. ROI for zoning amendments. And then also the continued hearing on the city yards. So that will be back before the Commission. In addition to that, another hearing item is 401 Montana. That's a proposal for a kind of garden learning center at the northeast corner at Montana and 4th. February 6th, we have 826 2nd Street ARB appeal, and then a development review permit for a housing project at the corner of 21st and Virginia. So again, that's a project the Commission saw maybe a few years ago now, and so that will be back before you. Also that same night, zoning ordinance amendment red lines. At City Council on December 18th, the Council discussed the corporate housing issue and gave staff some direction. So we are looking at a definition for medium-term housing, and then also focusing on protecting rent control units, looking at maybe allowing the medium-term housing in commercial districts. So we are, based on Council's direction, looking into that, and we'll follow up with you later. January 8th, which was last night, we had an extension of 2 interim ordinances, one for the demolition IZO, and then also the prohibition on fast food uses on the promenade IZO. So both of those were extended. And then at the next council meeting on January 22nd is the 11th Street Historic District. That will be before the council. Upcoming community meetings, January 10th, Ocean Avenue Project EIR scoping meeting. That's the Ocean Avenue Hotel. Yep. And then January 28th, update on the Link project. The Ocean Avenue Project EIR scoping meeting at 6 p.m. in the Civic Center East Wing. And then the update on the Link project is, again, January 28th, and that's 6:30 at John Muir. And then I just wanted to mention a new process that we'll be adopting for the city, or for the Planning Commission, which is similar to City Council, which is for the posting of public correspondence. We will need to receive it by noon on Wednesday in order to have it posted. And yeah, that's pretty much it. It needs to be in by noon in order to be posted on the agenda.
Okay, Commissioner Solomon Rogers.
So, thank you, David. On the December 18th meeting, they also did the IZO. They also directed the IZO for extremely low income housing in the HPP. Is that so? That's like February, March, right?
We're looking at some possible options in February and March. The council's direction was to bring something back as soon as possible. But they definitely gave direction for the Planning Commission to discuss this item. We're just taking a look at our agenda management, and we'll have an update at your next meeting.
Great, thank you. And then on the summary of the corporate housing direction, That was a long night. I recall there was some discussion of including a definition for domicile or some exploration of defining intended permanent residence in some form or not, some form or other. Is there a summary posted of what the direction actually was yet, or? I'm just curious in terms of understanding what our scope's going to be as we keep
I
thinking it
don't
through.
believe. I mean, the council has meeting minutes. There's the video
Yeah.
of the meeting. This was we were kind of just providing kind of the high level
Okay.
highlights of it. There was a lot of discussion about domicile, but I don't believe it made it into the final motion from the council. However, it was just study session direction, so I'm sure when we bring back actual language, there may be some further discussion
Great.
about that.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, any further questions for the planning director? Okay, there are no statements of official actions. We are now into the public hearing, and it's item 7A, which is on the consent calendar. Do I hear any?
I'll move the consent calendar.
Chair, just
Yeah,
just may make one
please.
correction for that one on condition 14. It reads that last part of the sentence, that condition, it reads studio. That's a typo. It should actually say restaurant. So I just want to make that correction.
You say typo, that's a whole other different word. I mean, it's not a couple of letters.
But remember, this is an alcohol CUP.
Right, okay,
The
yeah.
letters get blurry.
However, I'd still move consent.
Okay.
Sorry.
Second?
Do you have your motion as revised?
Yes, as
Yeah,
revised.
Then I'll second it.
Okay. Any discussion? Okay. Let's have a roll call. Oh, voice vote on this? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any nays and abstentions? None. Okay. Let's move on. Okay.
I move the next item in the same spirit.
I would like to take a little executive privilege here and move 8B up quickly because we may be inadvertently losing one of our recently returned members, and I'd like to have that decided before he leaves, if possible. He may not leave. So this is a discussion regarding a candidate from the commission who may want to be on the Development Standard Committee that's coming up for the new R1 standards. And, of course, we always vote people in who aren't here to do that work, right? So,
Yeah.
right. So is there anyone here who would like to volunteer for that?
I'll nominate Leslie Lambert.
Well,
I happen to know that she would accept the nomination if so nominated.
I see. Any other nominations? Any discussion?
It was pleasure. I'll second it. I'm sure she's watching, so.
Okay. Any questions? Okay, I would. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if we could have one sentence about what this is.
So this is following up on Council's direction to update the R1 development standards, specifically to address new home construction. So the process we're following is somewhat similar to if you were kind of around when we did the NOMA updates. And we're creating a technical working group primarily consisting of design professionals, contractors, architects, and the like, who have experience, very specific experience working with the standards. We also did send an invitation to leaders of neighborhood groups who have expressed interest in the process as well. That letter went out in December, and we were asking for people to respond until, I think it was January the 10th, if I recall. Okay. As of a couple weeks ago, we had about 14 responses. To that, we don't have a predetermined size of this meeting or this group, but it's meant to be a technical group that's working through kind of the nuances and the weeds with us. It's a two-part process, working with staff, and then we then plan to present that to the broader public, and have a broader community process. So we don't want people to feel like if you don't, get into this, that you won't have an opportunity. We just really need an opportunity to work with folks who, really are getting into the weeds with us on the standards.
Okay. So I'm okay in a sense with nominating someone who's not here, but I think she needs to be here to accept the nomination. So if she doesn't, then we can revisit this issue and get back on the train maybe a little later than we hope, but we would still be there because it's next week. So, okay. So all those in favor of nominating Leslie?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, good. All right, thank you for waiting. So now we're on item 8A, which is the Pico Wellness Project. Oh, sorry.
Good evening, commissioners. Happy New Year. Prospero año. Peter James, City Planning, and I have the pleasure this evening of partnering with our colleagues in the Office of Civic Wellbeing to talk about the Pico Wellbeing Project. The purpose of the meeting tonight is to reflect upon the past couple of months of action in the Pico community, and more specifically to talk about a series of zoning workshops that we've held that have provided a view into some potential changes that might be in order for Pico Boulevard. I wanted to first start out by talking a little bit about the composition of our planning team. It's not really a planning team as by definition, but it's more of an action-oriented project team. The core members are planning, the Office of Civic Wellbeing, and the Santa Monica Library. And we are supported by all of the other departments within the city that we provide feedback to one another, resources, in an effort to bring some relief and some much-needed community-led urbanism to the Pico neighborhood. This is really just a prelude to me introducing Julie Rusk and Cecilia Tovar to come and step up and talk a little bit about the background of the project, some efforts that we've all been engaged with, and some milestones that we've reached. I also want to point out that we have Carrie Fakui in the audience, and absent tonight is Amy Miller. She's in Baja. So here is Julie.
Good evening, Commissioner. So I'll think what I'll do, as Peter said, what we wanted to do is give you a little context of what we've been doing in the last few months, and then tell you a little bit again about the background of the project before you spend the evening talking about zoning. So interestingly, a year ago tonight, last January 9th, at the council meeting, they acted on, I believe, a discussion that you had in December of 2017 about how to approach the Pico neighborhood. And there's a pretty specific item that had been on your list as a priority to really look at the zoning issues. On January 9th, what the council did was they said, you know, we really want you to do that. The zoning issue is important. We want to get it going. We also want you to do that in the context of a larger understanding of what the neighborhood is all about, needs, and we want you to think differently about the way you create the partnership with the community, who you involve. We want you to broaden the sort of numbers of people that are involved. And I think they also talked about, and we want you to be deeper and more intentional about how you work together. So not just get a little bit of feedback, but really work with people in a thoughtful way to co-create solutions. They also talked about us being action-oriented as opposed to the sort of traditional plan-oriented way that the city approaches things. So this is was a bit of an innovation project. The reason our Office of Civic Wellbeing is involved is because part of, as you know, because we've talked with you before, we created a well-being framework and index in order to understand how people in Santa Monica are doing. And that distinction of how the community is doing versus how the city is doing, they obviously relate. But this idea of looking at the multifaceted ways you help a neighborhood and community to thrive, and you think about the economic issues, the health, the learning, the sense of social connection in a more holistic way, that's what this well-being concept, framework, and measurement is all about. So it was sort of in that spirit that we came together to try new things, work together to really see what we could do in Pico. So what did we do? The next couple slides kind of briefly walk you through over 25 different discrete workshops and events and activities that we participated in between June and November of last year. We started off in the spring. The city manager really wanted us to be sure to bring city staff along in this effort. So the first thing we did last April and May was we conducted Two pretty intensive, couple hours each, workshops with 60 staff from every department was represented to generate ideas. And the concept here was, we know we have lots of people out there working in various ways with all of our community members, but Pico in particular. So, you know, at Virginia Park alone, we've got staff from Human Services, the library, Farmers Market. We've got a lot of community-based agencies. The idea was to begin to get some of those folks, along with our public works staff, et cetera, engaged in thinking about what works, what's needed, what can we do now. We did a number of something called coffee chats, where we went out into community core kind of common spaces and talked with people and met people in other places to hear what was on their minds. We attended events and festivals, and we stood up a website, which I think many of you are familiar with. That sounds like, okay, you stood up a website, but you know, what we did was we tried to have an interactive website. We have some maps on there. We wanted it to really be an engagement opportunity, and we're pleased that we've had over 900 interactions on the website with various input. We've done a couple of engagement activities at John Adams Middle School. A team from a subgroup of our team went out and did some of the sort of more engaging building of what people wanted to see for Pico. We got 140 ideas plus from the young people. It was really interesting to hear them echo many of the same comments and feedbacks that we've heard in general. Is this community for us? Will we be able to live here? Some people wanted buildings to go really tall, some people didn't, but the kids had a really dynamic, engaged discussion. We visited a number of the community-based organizations, and then we held 3 community workshops, which were the larger events that, the last of which I think most of you attended on November 14th on zoning. We averaged about 75 people. We were very intentional about tracking who attended. There's a lot of I think really legitimate feeling that it's important that we hear the voice of the residents who live there. So we feel like we've really been pretty intentional about that. Through those workshops, we generated, or the community generated, about 1,500 ideas. So we knew that we needed to get to zoning, but in the meantime, this idea of how do you stimulate some quick action was really also on our mind. So we were standing up a project out of the Office of Civic Wellbeing, which is these new microgrants. And essentially microgrants are a $500 given to residents who pitch an idea that's selected to do something in their community that really helps to build community. And I have to say, it exceeded my expectations. Some of the things that I think are particularly notable is we don't typically move fast in the city, but we moved pretty fast this time. The applications were accepted in June. By the end of August, the mayor gave out the 8 winning $500 checks, and all of the 8 projects began in September and finished in December. Over 600 people were engaged in the various activities, and so for $4,000, the ingenuity, the leadership, the creativity of residents resulted in everything from a listening project that Edison School 5th graders did with elders in the community, where they interviewed them and now they want to turn them into podcasts, to a variety of workshops and activities that were, I think, really exciting. A pop-up playground, some of you may have heard about that, at a vacant lot on 19th Street. Here's some photos from the events. They were really positive, and I think are part of the proof of concept of this notion that with a little bit of support and sort of elevating good ideas and connecting people, we can really learn a lot from and help the community to really unleash itself with great ideas. So we're very excited about that. So again, the process has been designed with a lot of intention around equity. Really, as you know, we focused on doing everything in English and Spanish, providing childcare and support for families, food, hands-on activities, really trying to make the work of giving input and action for community fun and engaging. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Cecilia. It's been great to have the library as a partner. They're a key resource in our community and have been a great ally and asset in this work. So, Cecilia.
Hello. I am Cecilia Tovar, and I am principal librarian at the Santa Monica Public Library, so I oversee branches and the programming. So we're just going to give you a little bit of the project background and why we actually went into what Julie was describing. And let me just put this a little bit. So this is really the why. When we were looking at the Pico neighborhood and when I got invited to be part of this team, at first was kind of puzzle. Why? How? But it was actually, I think, a really great because the library is really an institution that the community trusts. And I think that we get to hear and also observe what's going on in the neighborhoods with all our 5 branches. And for this one was very important because the Pico neighborhood, all these areas that we're seeing happens at Pico. And through the work that the staff was doing there and all the nonprofits and the community, we're like, oh my God, this area is really touched in so many ways. And so we wanted to make sure that we bring it all together and really truly, like the City Council wanted to make sure that we engage the community. Here's just a little bit of previous plans and efforts that you probably are familiar with, and this is when it happened, 1983, 1998, all the way to 2015. And so it was very interesting to hear people in the community to talk about the different plans and how zoning was really talking about what they need in the community, and then maybe was going to resolve some issues. So it's just kind of, very important to understand what the community was saying about housing, displacement, business environment, and responsive. But also we wanted to take into I'm sorry. We wanted to take all this information that we find out through the Wellbeing Index and other data to really see if these areas were matching with the Pico strengths. And what the people are saying in the community. So this is what we have right now, and that's what we find out through our Wellbeing Index. And then here are the challenges. So through this process, I think that people were really focused on what the zoning was going to do to help us through these challenges that could probably help. And so obviously these topics are even higher and more in depth and more difficult to be able to do something about it. But I think that the community engagement was very much on board with everything. And so I think through this process we have learned that our most vulnerable voices are actually coming and engaging and talking about what they really want. And not only that, but also the education, because maybe the more stronger voices or loudest voices were saying, well, this is what we need with zoning, but actually going through the workshops and doing the education with different groups and in different languages really actually, I think that the people were starting to see, oh, maybe this is a different way. How can I actually get involved or understanding and maybe not asking, things that it might take a long time. And now, Peter.
This is yours? Okay. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of history here, and then we're going to jump into the zoning just to set the context for the neighborhood. We've presented this portion at previous workshops that you did not attend, so we just wanted to make sure that you had the same context that the rest of the community does. So for thousands of years, the land that would become Santa Monica was inhabited by the native Tongvans, who occupied the Los Angeles Basin, southern Channel Islands, and parts of Orange County. The Spanish colonization beginning in 1769 led to the violence and decline of the Tongan people. The Spanish Empire established Alta California, and the Mission San Gabriel Archangel, which was founded in 1771, shown here on this map, controlled a large area of the Santa Monica Basin. Approximately 5,000 Tongvans were within that area in 50 different villages. In the 19th century, after the Mexican War of Independence, which ended in 1821, Alta California became a territory of Mexico. And the last governor of Alta California under Mexican rule was named Pio Pico, for which Pico Boulevard and the Pico neighborhood is named. During the Mexican rule, land in Alta California was allotted to separate owners as ranchos, and the Rancho Boca de Santa Monica was included in the present-day city and mountains of Santa Monica, south to Pico Boulevard. The Rancho Bologna was located south of Pico Boulevard, which accounts for the change in the street grid on different sides of Pico, which is pretty interesting. After the Mexican-American War, which ended in 1848, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the rancho system was eroded, and finally Colonel Robert S. Baker acquired the land, and then he sold it to Senator John P. Jones, who subdivided the lot at auction and became present-day Santa Monica. Most of that land was really controlled into two tracts. There was the Erkenbrecher Syndicate, which I believe was between 14th Street and Centinela, and the Towner Terrace, which was from 14th Street south. A lot of the early land uses here was the cemetery, the brick plants, like the Simmons brick plant. For any commissioners that were around during the Bergamot area plan, we talked a lot about the brickyard, the dump. That was all old rancho territory, then Erkenbrecher Syndicate, and then finally became Santa Monica's industrial lands. The 20th century was really a time of growth for Santa Monica. It was also a time of divisiveness. Due to discriminatory zoning practices, Pico neighborhood, this general area, became one of the only places that people of African American descent, Mexican descent, Japanese descent could own homes. So those cultures really flourished in this area, but they were marked by periods of divisiveness caused by the Santa Monica Freeway in the 60s. Previous to that, the Second World War, where many of the Nikkei population were interred in internment camps. And this memorial to those times underneath the freeway overpass on Stewart Street is testament to the hardships, and as well as to the community's resilience to continue to reach across whatever infrastructure, whatever barriers are put in their place to stay connected to their neighbors. Clearly, events like this shaped the neighborhood, led to the formation of advocacy in many different ways throughout many different eras. The P&A was actually formed in the late 70s to heal the wounds of the freeway officially. They lobbied and successfully got some funding to create the very first Pico Neighborhood Community Plan, which had many aspirations to enhance social services, to provide much needed jobs, to improve crime and safety standards in the city, and many of those have been met. But of course, the present day provides new challenges. In the late 90s, the Pico Improvement Organization, which is the BID that oversees Pico Boulevard, was formed. Later in the 2000s, we have new community groups coming in, the Parent Connection Group, largely an African American group, Familias Latinas Unidas, all who operate out of Virginia Avenue Park today. And between 1976 and 2005, the city and the community really put together a lot of advocacy and funding to create what is now Virginia Avenue Park, a lot of lot consolidation and acquisitions to create what is truly the hub of the community today, crowned by the Pico Library that opened in 2014 with the adjacent annex. I thought I'd put a couple of demographics up on the slide, since housing and displacement is another focus of this project, not just zoning. And I apologize for the graininess of the slides. I tried to have City TV and I worked on this a little bit prior to the meeting, but I think it's just the fault of the fonts being too small. But the bottom line is the graph that's up at the top here shows the sort of racial makeup of Pico compared to Santa Monica in the center column and Los Angeles on the right. You can see that Pico has the blue is the white portion, and the green and the yellow and the orange are Asian and African American and other race. Pico has about 46% non-white compared to 23% non-white in Santa Monica as a whole. And then lower down here in this second set of graphs, this is within Pico, it shows over time how the racial demographics have really shifted from the 70s all the way up to the last census in 2010. Some things of note is to show that really the percentage of those folks that identify as white has remained relatively stable, while the African American population has been in decline. We're about half of where we were at in 1970. The Asian population is on the rise, whereas the Hispanic population is in a state of decline from a high in about the 1980s. Pico makes up about 10% of our population, so all these other supporting graphics are quite significant. Pico has a higher percentage of folks that rent than citywide. Santa Monica is very famous for its high percentage of renters, at about 74% these days. Pico's at about 80, which means that the other 20% own homes. And if you look to the right here, you can see that that's sort of something else that we're tracking, that home values, like everywhere else in the city and the region, are going up. That's certainly true for Pico. So it's increasingly more difficult to own a home in Pico. Sean, did you have a comment?
What are the two tracks?
Okay, that's a good point. Thanks for pointing it out. So the way that we did this analysis was using a variety of data sources. We used the census, and we used the American Community Survey, and they use census tracts to collect their data. So Pico is composed of 2 census tracts. The first one goes from Lincoln to 20th, and then the second, Pico Tract 2, goes from 20th all the way up to Centinela. So let's see if I can, the dark blue line is from Lincoln to 20th. It's sort of slightly less of a sharp angle than Pico Tract 2. Pico Tract 2 is where the predominance of single-family homes in the Pico neighborhood exists, which is what's driving up that graph. There's a tremendous amount of rent-controlled units still in Pico, about 74%. 74% of all units are rent-controlled, but 61% of that 74%, if you follow me there, are at market due to turnover and changes in the population. As a whole, households are generally a bit larger in Pico than they are citywide. That means more people living in the same amount of space, with a percentage of 9% overcrowding. And we just put this affordable housing number here just to remind people how dire circumstances are within the region. We have 19,000 people on our affordable housing wait list, of which 3,000 of those are Santa Monica residents. As far as household income is concerned, Pico is slightly less than the citywide average, at about 59,000. The dot map here really begins to show how that stacks up to other census tracts within the city. The area in blue is the area of our focus, our zoning focus anyway. And if you break that further down by race, you can see how each category is doing. I'll allow you to draw your own conclusions and stare at that for a moment, but I think it's pretty telling. And keep in mind that the blue charts is 2000s, and then the yellow is present day. So you can really see how things have changed in just a decade and a half. The last slide on this is to talk more about the assets rather than the things that give us pause. While there are some issues that we're definitely working on in Pico, there's also a lot of assets. Pico's home to 4 terrific parks, several of which are new. Ishihara Park, Memorial Park is soon to be redone. Virginia Avenue Park, of course, has that new fantastic centerpiece of the Pico Library, where a tremendous amount of activities and educational services and community enrichment happens. As far as the boulevard's concerned, it's predominantly commercial. This will feed into our zoning conversation later on, with only about 25% of it residential. And of that 25%, we do have a portion of R3 closer down to Euclid Street, and then we have some very large residential developments on the boulevard itself, of which I'm sure you're aware. So here's what we've done on the zoning issue. Julie mentioned we've conducted a number of community meetings. 2 of our 3 have really focused on zoning. The first workshop with the Planning Commission did not attend, although a few of you may have. Drew in about 75 people. And this was a really fun and engaging workshop. We tried really hard to demystify what zoning is and how it affects people's lives. We didn't use planner language. We brought in James Rojas, and we had people build basically memories from their childhood to start the conversation. And then we tied that to place, saying like, if your favorite memory was an ice cream shop, that was a land use decision that somebody made 30 years ago, that ice cream shop should go on Pico Boulevard, for example. So then we had them build what they wanted their vision to be. And so it was a really great way to connect folks to this strange, esoteric business that we're all in around zoning to something that's real in their lives, something that they can focus on. And I think that gets to what Cecilia was saying, is that they began to speak up, they began to understand, and that's given us some great content to move forward with this process. And here's what they said in that very first meeting, was they wanted to have things that were more accessible, pedestrian-friendly, bike-friendly, places where they could gather and hang out and drift along the boulevard, tuck in for an afternoon. They were concerned about affordable housing. That's a comment that we've heard throughout, well, I'll say throughout the entire time I've been here in Santa Monica and have worked in the Pico neighborhood. That's been a consistent theme throughout all the conversations. And then they really focused in on some businesses that they felt were a little bit absent, things like mental health, bakeries, dance studios, recreational opportunities. And they wanted to keep it small to medium scale and capital letters affordable. And that came through in the second workshop as well. The one that you attended, where you had a slightly less of a crowd and a community protest. That's definitely a first for us. But those that endured rolled up their sleeves and went through the exercise and gave us a tremendous amount of content to bring back and analyze and evaluate against our current zoning practices, specifically around land use regulations and really specifically around ground floor land use regulations. We stayed completely away from development standards. And I want to make that clear here, is that we're not really talking at this point about development standards. We're really talking about the land uses that people want to see on Pico Boulevard. And here's a sampling of what they said. Some of the stuff is already in our zoning ordinance. They don't want to see a lot of liquor stores unless it's really good stuff, like the curated craft beer and the nice whiskeys. I think they're not so interested in hotels or motels or even large-scale uses, like even large-scale restaurants. Like they want to see a cheesecake factory on Pico Boulevard. But they were interested in things that serve their community, things like daycare and smaller entertainment uses. Cultural facilities came out loud and clear, as well as personal services, things like salons and nail shops, places that reminded them of their experiences when they were children with their grandparents or their families, places where they would hang out with their community. We replicated that workshop online on our website. This was a easy to use, interactive. Do you like this? Yes, no, maybe, in both languages. We have data on that. Again, the results were very, very similar to what we got in the workshop, with the exception of auto repair. For some reason, folks online wanted auto repair, whereas folks in person did not. So we'll have to wrestle with that in the next month or so. So that all leads us to, what are we going to do with this? What are our options? And it's really the focus of this discussion with the Planning Commission this evening, if you'll entertain it. And we thought we would put together a couple of options for all of us to chew on tonight. It's not limitless. It's the zoning ordinance after all, so there's just a few. And they have their advantages and their disadvantages. But a good way to get into this is to start with our objectives. Start with what we heard and what we have been hearing ever since the development of the Luce, which recorded many of these same requests. And so here we are now in the process, and we want to bring it back. So I'll just go through them quickly. The first objective is to create that small and medium scale active environment on Pico Boulevard, to expand opportunities for businesses to locate on Pico, businesses that aren't that have barriers currently to operating on Pico Boulevard, to reduce red tape and paperwork, to allow businesses to grow from small to medium to possibly large, and then also to bring in some things that have been long verboten on Pico, but condition them so that they don't get too out of control. And these would be things like bars and nightclubs and things of that nature. And the question is, why now? Like, normally what we would do is we would go through a long, protracted process where we would bring, after several years, the regulations and the development standards together for a final adoption, and then it would be implemented through some kind of plan. That really wasn't the direction that council gave us. They said, when you have something to work with it now. And we have land use regulations on Pico Boulevard that we can work with now. So we bring the land use regulations before you. We think of it as phase 1A of several phases. We may come back at another time to work more on development standards. We haven't had that conversation with the community yet. So we don't feel that it's appropriate to dive into that at the moment. So here's options for discussion. Things we can do on Pico Boulevard to the neighborhood commercial and the mixed-use Boulevard low districts if we choose. The first option is to create a overlay district on top of both of the land use districts. And I put the definition that's in the zoning ordinance in the general terms here. It's basically another set of standards that lie on top of the base district beneath it that modify them in some way. In this case, it may be that they're more permissive than what's allowed in the neighborhood commercial currently, just for Pico Boulevard. And the advantage of this is that we can map it, so you can open up the zoning ordinance, you can see that the colors are different on the zoning ordinance map for Pico Boulevard. If you're a business, if you're a property owner, you see right away that it's not the same as Main Street or Montana. And that's a big advantage just for legibility. The other advantage of doing an overlay district is that we can just address the land use issue right now. We don't have to address the development standard issue, which is part and parcel with the direction of what council directed us to do. Another option is to make changes to the neighborhood commercial and the mixed use Boulevard land use designations within the land use table that's in our zoning ordinance. So we could create 2 new columns in the land use table and say NC parentheses Pico, MUBL parentheses Pico, and affect those changes that way. It's easy to implement. That's one of the advantages. We just have to create the columns. We don't have to do the same in the development standards table. We have that system already kind of happening right now. But one of the disadvantages is that we can't map it. So if that's the route that we choose, we have to create references within the code saying, asterisks, between Euclid and Centinela, this applies. And so that would require the reader to look both at the map and then at the reference to understand what his or her rights are or are not. The last option, which is the biggest one, is to create a new zoning district for Pico. Just like any other zoning district, a new color on the map, a new chapter in the book. And this is pretty straightforward. It's mappable. But the disadvantage at this moment in time is that it requires that we have the associated development standards in place, which, again, we don't have because we haven't had that conversation with the community. We anticipate going there eventually as we enter into the housing discussion later on this spring, talking about, affordable housing, the role of housing in the community, where it could go, and if it is to go on the boulevard, do we perhaps need more height than the neighborhood commercial district provides, or even the mixed-use Boulevard low district provides. So that is the reality of this option. With that, I will close the staff presentation and allow the commission to ponder these 3 options. We're certainly available for questions, and I believe there are a few speakers that have sent in some chits to speak.
Okay. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
First of all, are there any questions from the dais? Okay, we can always revisit this, but
I'll ask one just clarifying, 2 clarifying questions, Peter. One, is, so you said Euclid to Centinela. What's happening between Lincoln and Euclid on Pico?
That's a great question. Let me go back to this map. We have targeted this zone because this is really where the neighborhood commercial designation begins on Pico Boulevard. West of Euclid, the brown on that map is R3. That's a medium density residential, and
But
west.
not at the corner of Pico and Lincoln.
Well, our project area doesn't go to the corner of
Okay.
Pico and Lincoln. We stop somewhere right before that because then Lincoln, the Lincoln corridor is dominant there.
Goes, okay.
Right. So we are intentionally not proposing that we modify the R3 land use regulations or the general commercial regulations.
Okay, I guess I'm curious because on the south side of Pico, west of Euclid, there are some neighborhood serving businesses. I think there's I know there's ice cream there, but there's there's like a tutoring center, and there are some things that are really for.
There's a lot of Claire Foundation.
Yeah,
stuff
there's a
there.
lot of local stuff there, which is
right,
why I was asking.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you another piece of this is that when the original request was made to evaluate the zoning standards, it was really to look at the distinction or the commonality between neighborhood commercial and mixed-use boulevard low. It seemed that the community and the council's interest wasn't so much focused on the general commercial, because we still need a place for that to be. And the general commercial is actually more permissive than both of those designations in terms of things like auto repair and social service providers and things like that. So we don't want to mess with that too much.
Okay. And my second question is, you talked about that the conversation has not yet happened about development standards. What about circulation issues?
Circulation issues definitely have come to the fore in terms of our idea sprints, our community clotheslines. As we speak, the mobility managers at the Pico Improvement Organization talking about mobility, hearing from the business community. We've certainly heard it from the residential community. And as I mentioned, we are a partnership that is citywide. I think what we will probably end up doing on the mobility front is to provide more access to information about a lot of the studies, the physical improvements that are coming to the Pico neighborhood. One thing that we've heard, just to share with you quickly, is that people feel like they don't have a huge grasp on everything that's going on.
Right.
They may be able to attend one meeting or two meetings, but there's literally so much going on in Pico and in the city, as you know, as planning commissioners, that it's hard for anybody to kind of come to grips with it. So an idea that we have is to sort of hold a large meeting where everybody comes with all their projects and people are able to provide input in that way and stay connected.
Any other questions? Peter, I have two questions.
Yes,
one, we had a workshop that we attended. How many people attended that workshop?
That one, I think, was about 50 people.
Okay. And then you did the same thing online.
Yes.
How many people responded online?
We had 9 people respond online.
Okay. But the distribution was roughly the same, you suggested.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
Distribution
the
of this-
distribution between the land uses with the exception of the auto repair.
Okay. Can you put up that bar chart that had all those different suggested uses? That
This
one
one?
there, yeah. And can you tell us what the top 3 or 4 negatives were?
Negative: liquor store, hotel and motel, auto sales and service.
Okay. And then the top 4 positives?
Cultural facility, general market, physical training, nursery and garden center, and I'll add the 5th, small restaurant.
Smallest. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure.
You have a question?
Forgive me. The next version of this, it would be great to have the maybe in between the yes and the no.
Yeah.
If that's at all possible,
It
because
is.
what I was curious about where there seems to have been some significant ambivalence on a couple of these items.
Yeah.
Reflecting what we heard in the meetings as well.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So, is there some division about what is that middle one that had only yes and maybe.
Yeah.
Walk-in.
Can you read that?
Walk-in clientele,
social service center, adult daycare, medium restaurant, and then it starts to move instructional services, and then it starts to move more positive.
And for a majority, we're looking at 4 and higher or 5 and higher?
Oh, for a majority, we're looking at, I'm going with 5 and higher.
Okay.
Yeah, and then again, this is also informed by the online stuff, and then just a tremendous amount of comments that we call ideas that were generated in our previous workshop and our staff stuff. We also conducted a series of, I want to say, like 40 interviews with city staff to prepare for this project, to find out the people that work in the Pico neighborhood, to find out what's going on, what's working, what's not working with city programs. And so we have a lot of intel from our economic development department about the barriers that they hear about of people trying to get into Pico, working with the PIO, things that kind of come offline that aren't part of the data set that we can easily tabulate from the matrix that you saw us design at the workshop, or the the Excel sheet that comes out of the website.
Okay. No further questions for now. Let's have community input. And let's have the first person, which is Ellis Raskin. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Ellis Raskin. I am a Santa Monica resident. I'm also on the Urban Forest Task Force, and I'm an environmental and land use attorney, but I'm here to speak to you tonight as a concerned resident of the Pico neighborhood. As you know, just a few years ago, our city went through the process of preparing an EIR for the land use and circulation element. And of course, any zone change to the Pico neighborhood is going to have cascading citywide effects, especially with regard to circulation. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to sit in a car on Pico heading eastbound between 4 and 6 p.m., but it's a nightmare. That's just one example. Housing is another example of an environmental impact that will have cascading citywide effects. So I think it's important as part of this discussion, and I'd love to talk to city staff offline afterwards, to consider that through the environmental review process that we consider the citywide impacts to land use and circulation that occur as a result of this process. So thank you for your time. Good night.
Thank you. Okay, Jerry Rubin.
Thank you. Happy New Year. I really glad I came. Excellent staff report. A lot of good work put in there. My wife and I live right on the edge of Ocean Park and Pico neighborhood right there. And it's good that a lot of love is coming again to the Pico neighborhood. I remember the whole process about Virginia Park and the library and everything, and all the excitement that happens at the college there. And it's a great place, so I'm glad this is happening. I'm glad you're all concerned, even though you might not live in the Pico neighborhood. Just like I know a lot of people in the Pico neighborhood that go to meetings affecting other parts of the city, and that's why it is so important that we keep these things citywide, because that's just the way it is. I mean, I don't want to get off topic, but the districts in Santa Monica seems like it would have a negative effect even on this process. You want to keep it open to everyone. There are people that I've talked to that live in other districts other than Pico neighborhood, but work in Pico neighborhood. So I really just wanted to bring that out. And you shouldn't have to have a representative on every commission in the city from a different district. You just want to have a love for all the great city of Santa Monica and how it interconnects, and the unity and the diversity and the individuality. And that's what we've always been doing. You show it right here. I never heard you say, I'm not interested in Pico neighborhood. That's not where I live. Never, ever. And same thing with Pico, the people that live at Pico neighborhood. They come to meetings downtown, north of Montana, everywhere. It's the way it should be, and voice their input. And it should be counted that way. So I say, as you proceed right now, I want to say that you're doing a great job. Affordability, that's a great thing. Cultural stuff, as far as more nightclubs or sports bars or things like that, be careful. I still remember the issue of that club on Wilshire Boulevard. What was the name of that? Again, remember that, and how the neighbors regretted that, and finally they closed down. So you're doing a good job. Thank you.
Okay. So that closes the public testimony. Thank you. And let's go on to discussion. Jason.
Yes, thank you, Peter, and all for that report. You spoke to the work to come on the development standards. Could you elaborate a little bit on what areas within the Pico neighborhood are going to be looked at in terms of the development standards?
Yeah. So as a action-oriented project that is not creating a plan, we were a little bit nimble here. We know that our next foray is going to be centered around housing. So we'll be entering the neighborhood at this point. We'll be
into R2.
Into the R2, yeah. And Pico also has R1 as well. We suspect that immediate, we'll need to address immediate issues more quickly than long-term ones, but we will get to development standards eventually. It's a question really about where the neighborhood wants to accommodate new housing ultimately. And the boulevard question has always been presented by the loose. It was sort of retracted a bit by council during the zoning ordinance episode. So this could be an opportunity to revisit that. And development standards, whether they are resident within the R2, the R1, or MUBL or NC, I think it will all have to sort of come under one cohesive discussion about the community's tolerance for greater heights or not, their ability to act quickly, both quickly and with a long-term view towards affordability and equity in terms of the housing options that we present, especially given the numbers that we showed earlier about overcrowding. We have also Pico. One thing I didn't put up there has to do a lot with the age of the Pico population. Pico's a lot younger than the rest of the city, which means that the kids are going to need a place to buy or rent as time comes up. So this is kind of a long-winded way of saying I don't exactly know. We don't have a specific program for when development standards are going to come into play, but I can't imagine we would have a conversation about housing without having a conversation about development standards ultimately.
Oh, and so that will include both the boulevard and the residential districts, all connected.
I see them being connected ultimately.
Perhaps, we'll see how it unfolds, but potentially in a similar type of discussion as we had for the loose in general.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And then going back to the focus of your presentation tonight and land uses, at least the way I was initially struck by our meeting at Virginia Avenue Park was that a lot of the goals and a lot of the identified preferred uses seem to align with the objectives of the loose and the objectives of the zoning ordinance. Mm-hmm. So you're presenting a few different ways of making adjustments, and I'm wanting to understand how far-reaching you think, based on the input that you have so far, those adjustments could be. Are there significant changes from what is currently allowed, with the regulations on the boulevard, and what would be more likely to produce the kind of outcomes that participants in this process are hoping for?
It's a great question, and I have an answer for you. The answer is that the changes are pretty subtle, to be honest, but I think they'll make a big impact if they are pursued by private entrepreneurs in the way that the boulevard functions. Going through the land use table, which we've done many times since that meeting, it appears that a combination of moving some things that are not permitted into the permitted category, bringing some things that are conditionally permitted into the permitted category, and then also allowing some businesses to expand. I don't know how well you know the limitations in the zoning ordinance, but a lot of the neighborhood commercial is held by the L2 limitation, which means it can't be any wider than 40 feet or 7,500 square feet. We would propose that we provide them with the option of the L17, which allows for 50 feet. So these are like very subtle changes, but if you do the analysis on the boulevard, over 77% of Pico Boulevard parcels are 50 feet wide. So it makes a lot of sense to do that. So it's a small change with big implications. There's probably about 14 to 16 uses that would be affected by this overlay, if that's where you decide to go. So nothing cataclysmic, but significant in its own right.
Right. And I'm sure if we went through a similar process in other neighborhoods on Montana, down on Main Street, we would get some important differences, but I would also expect that there would be general agreement. So if, as we're going through and we're seeing something that might work well on Pico, I would hope that we also are keeping in mind that it seems like this commission is constantly considering adjustments to the zoning ordinance throughout the city, and that some good lessons that come from this process on Pico Boulevard may be applicable elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it's just, from our perspective, it's about doing the work. So we've been authorized or directed by the council to do the work specifically in this one particular part of the city. And when you get to that level of detail, literally with your tape measure, walking down Pico Boulevard, measuring every single storefront, new information comes to light. So yeah, if this was to be replicated, and in fact that is something we've been thinking about with the Pico Wellbeing Project, that in its original intention was really to create a replicable model to work within neighborhood contexts to address issues that larger planning efforts just can't accomplish because they're grandiose and citywide. And
I would also add to that this zoning piece is kind of like one very small factor, within the broader context of what the Pico Wellbeing Project is about. And, we're getting to the things that we heard from a broad arc is, this concern about displacement, access to opportunity, and opportunities for residents in a neighborhood to participate, in opening a business or what have you, and recognizing the limitations that our regulations put on that. And I think we recognize Maine and Montana, the other neighborhood commercial districts, Ocean Park Boulevard, they are very, very different in the kinds of businesses that are there, who they serve, and so, the reason for looking at Pico differently, and it's really a hybrid of two different zones, which is not something that we have heard or seen as a problem in some of these other commercial areas, but within the arc and the themes of what we're hearing in Pico, zoning is one piece, but there's also a lot of the work that is happening now on the ground with PIO and with residents is looking at how can we, because land use regulations only go so far, how can you give a leg up to folks in business development, advertising their business? I mean, those sorts of things that are not land use related, right? They're more programmatic. And so this is really, just one way of getting at that issue just from a land use perspective, because it's something we can do quickly now, as opposed to something that's going to take months.
Like parking, for example.
Right, exactly.
Parking also came up as something that people are interested in relaxing, but that, of course, is a heavier lift and much more emotional in some ways than creating a permitted use out of a CUP.
So if I understand it, what's being said, one of the ways in which we are looking at
the issue of gentrification and displacement is how it factors into, how it feeds into the well-being of the community as a whole and as for individual households and individuals. And I imagine that particular zoning question, and there are other regulations that could be in place, but in terms of land use regulation, that will be, those questions will be raised within the discussion of the development standards, the questions of displacement.
Among others, right? Because it's
not
not just
exclusively.
about development standards.
Right.
That's the whole thing, actually. We should have started this presentation with this, is that zoning cannot solve everything.
Mm-hmm.
Land use regulations can't solve everything. It's almost like the low-hanging fruit at this point. We were directed to look at the zoning in Pico. We started with the commercial boulevard because that was what the general plan essentially told us to look at first. And we found some things we can fix quickly. When we get to the larger issues of gentrification and displacement, we will be looking at development standards, we'll be looking at rent control, the affordable housing production program. All these are in the mix for the next couple months, if not a couple of years. Not specifically with us either, by the way. We have other plates spinning in housing and economic development and rent control.
Right. Well, I'll end with 2 points. One, that I just love the fact that you all in the city as a whole is approaching this question from the perspective of well-being and how we can make the most of what we have there in the community and making adjustments that fit with the people that live there today, with anticipation of tomorrow's housing needs. Mm-hmm. But I just love the fact that you guys are approaching it in that way. And I'll also because I think it's so cool. The stretch of Pico Boulevard, I've said before, from basically the eastern half, to me is the most interesting boulevard in the city of Santa Monica. The mix of uses and the particular establishments that we have currently on Pico Boulevard is just, I mean, you can go take ski lessons. And then go across the street to the Wiener Schnitzel, and then go look at some classic cars. I mean, it's an incredible, it's an incredible part of town. And obviously, as we're going through this, we want to support the things that make the boulevard and the neighborhood as a whole special, while like I said, approaching it from the perspective of well-being. So thank you.
Welcome. And interestingly, that stretch that you're so fond of has the highest rate of vacancy on all of Pico Boulevard.
There's opportunity.
Yeah.
Richard?
So, Peter, this is in fact one of those lengthy, drawn-out processes that you alluded to, because this commission, I think in 2014 in the election, first raised the issue of Pico, and so did the council, and it took them 3 years to get it formally up and so on. So we're, whatever it is, 5 years into the process at the moment. So we're not exactly sprinting forward on this. And during that whole time, people have been raising the issue of displacement gentrification, which has been exacerbated by the arrival of the train. And I'm quite intrigued by what the answer of at least a couple of you will be. If in fact you make the ability to use some of the buildings easier by adding a 5 foot wider, won't that attract people to this boulevard who otherwise can't come there now to open businesses? You are also envisaging potentially much bigger businesses than 7,500 square feet. And that will bring even more economic pressure from people who are otherwise not in Santa Monica to come in, because it seems to me the really difficult problem we've got in Pico is that people who've lived there a long time on limited incomes are being displaced by the white-hot tech economy, people who come on the train, and a limited number of properties to live in or to rent. I do not know how you reconcile that. But so what's your answer first on if we change the rules about the size of the lots, the CUPs and so on, whether or not that attracts a whole other group of entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial activities, bigger chains, etc.?
Well, I think that's a hard question to answer, because
But you must have thought about it because you must have thought the consequences of what you do
Well,
through.
we have thought about it. I mean, I think where we go back to what we've heard the community say for decades, right? At least since the creation of the loose. The list before you here is not too different than the list that's recorded in the loose or any of the workshops that preceded that. All we're trying to do is create the opportunity for these things to happen, these things that are not happening right now to happen. There may be trade-offs. There's certainly more opportunity for slightly larger uses to occupy these spaces. But if we do nothing, then we just stay where we are.
I guess what you're really saying is you don't know what the answer to my question is.
I can't tell the future.
No, because we had a commissioner on here who lived in the Pico neighbourhood who almost laid down his life to make sure the standards were the same on Pico and Montana and Main Street. You might remember all those arguments with Commissioner Reese. And so that was an intriguing one. So we're uncertain about what would happen if we change those things. We just feel that something should change. Is that your approach?
Well, we've been told that things should change, and we haven't been telling ourselves. We've gone out and done the work to listen to the community, both the residential and the business
So
community.
which of the three approaches is the one favoured by you and your team?
Well, we're still mulling it over. I think the slides more or less speak for themselves. When we laid it out in terms of the advantages and the disadvantages, the land use overlay district provides the most legible way to affect these changes of any of the three.
But as a team, you haven't reached a conclusion about which would be the most effective yet, or you have?
Well, we think this.
Yeah,
I
think these options are they are a means to achieve the same goal. We're really talking about more of a procedural thing, and kind of just taking a little step back in terms of the changes. I mean, there was a substantial amount of field work that was done in preparation for the discussions with the community, and the changes in terms of like an additional 10 feet. I believe they're like largely consistent with actually what's already on Pico Boulevard. So, in terms of the 40-foot restriction versus a 50-foot restriction, it actually is more a reflection of what is on the ground today, instead of making it impossible for someone to move in because there's a rule that doesn't match actual, conditions that are actually on the boulevard. But in terms of this is more of a, we put this up there because it's a bit of a nuanced technical discussion of it, to show you kind of like what the difference is between doing and why we would potentially do an overlay district versus creating a brand new zoning district, which is something we have heard for a while now, from the Pico community about, this creation of a new zoning district. Is something that we've heard over and over again. And we wanted to explain why, we're not, potentially, and kind of the pros and cons of doing that at this point, because when you change that means changing a color on a map, and that has then ramifications for standards. And we haven't talked to anybody about standards yet because that's not where we are in this process. So this is really kind of showing you, where we are in a process, and Peter is on, we are talking about it.
We are. We're in the midst of it.
But the overlay zoning, the overlay district is something that gives us an opportunity to do something quickly, and it doesn't have implications for the standards that we haven't talked to anybody about yet.
No, but I think both you and Peter did say that you wanted to move quickly. You were directed to do so by the council. So in my view, you're here in January and come back in 10 weeks or 12 weeks, 3 months, with some sort of proposal. You must be thinking about it right now.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. I think that the overlay district is sort of what we're leaning the most towards, because it's the one that lets us accomplish some of these land use changes for the ground floor of Pico Boulevard that are implementing what we heard from the workshops without affecting kind of the remainder of the zoning phases that, are yet to come.
Yeah, and we don't know how quickly we can move on those, because those are much more weighty issues that are more intertwined with, everything that contributes to the gentrification.
And we see this as an iterative process: do one thing and then move on to the others, as opposed to the normal way we do stuff here.
We're trying that out.
So let me ask a question of Ms. Rusk or her team. So where does the well-being come into it? Because we've heard Peter on the planning, but what are you moving on expeditiously in terms of well-being to improve things on the ground.
You know what strikes me about this is zoning can only do so much. And so I think the real question is, are there other programmatic options or policies or incentives or disincentives that we can be thinking about given market forces, given our business community, given what we're hearing from residents about their desire to have opportunities to open their businesses. You know, we're actively in some of the other sort of components of the work looking at, you know, for instance, there's a new state vending law that just went into effect that really, a lot of what's being focused on is how places like the pier and the beach are impacted. The reality is this could have impacts all over the community. And are there so I say that with sort of a question that I think we have to grapple with. Are there resources or programmatic options that we can develop that are really outside the purview of a land use discussion, but have an interplay? So this is the hard stuff, right? How we really figure out what we're going to do to address these very difficult issues of displacement, gentrification, preserving the people who are there, but realizing that there's many forces that are beyond what a land use or zoning tool can address.
So, but it does look as though the council's directed and that the team here is moving expeditiously. So will you also come back as part of the other half of the package when Peter comes back, or the team, with a series of recommendations and ideas as the well-being part linked to the zoning? So if they come back and recommend a zoning overlay district in, I don't know, March or April, are you going to have a list of things that you might prepare, which includes micro grants, step
Well,
forwards
so
with
for
school?
instance, I'll give you sort of a little bit of a preview on that. I mentioned the micro grants. We wrapped up the first pilot phase, but what we're really thinking about is this issue of economic opportunity and economic engagement for the community. Can that be a theme for our next round of micro grants so that we really help people? Because we've heard now and seen evidence of some of the kinds of things people want to do. Can our farmers market play a different role? Can we pilot some initiatives? Again, these are more programmatic. They will take resources. They will be about what are the priorities in the sort of broader context, but these are some of the kinds of things we're thinking about. So economic opportunity related micro grants,
and then
to your point.
Some sort of social opportunity initiatives and grants as well would be good, wouldn't it?
Well, I think the ones we've done have been very focused on that, and basically what we've heard from the 8 folks that did these, there's various next steps that they'd all like to see in the work they're doing. So how we scale some of these things, or for instance, we've looked at how some of the folks who were microgrant recipients might apply through the library's programming process so that they can offer their programs through the library. You know, so how we can route people through things and make connections.
I guess what I'm trying to do is I've got Peter pinned down too.
Yeah.
He's going to prepare something and bring it back to us 3 or 4 months. Next week. Why so long? But shortly, will the other half of that evening be the well-being part of it with social and economic opportunities in some sort of package, or are you saying it'll be at some other time? Because it'd be great to see
the short answer is yes, and I'm glad you're asking, and I think this is the kind of thing we've got to continue to engage our colleagues and engage the community to create. So I wouldn't even call it the other half. I'd call it the sort of context of knitting these things together and finding other incentives, programmatic solutions, and most importantly, support for the residents themselves to develop the strategies that they've already named they want to see.
The reason I ask is I can't believe that we would go to the community and say we've made a series of changes to land use regulations along there and set up a zone, but we won't say anything about social or economic opportunities at the same time. I feel that we absolutely have to put a package to the community as a first step.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm putting to you. But I would also say to Peter and the team and everyone else here, we had the city yards here a few weeks ago, and they're coming back next week, and we asked the question, where's the access from the Pico area through the city yards, which is a super block, to the train station, and there was none in that proposal at that time, and I was incredibly disappointed, as was Commissioner Landis, about that. I thought that was a hugely missed opportunity. Is that not something that you and your team should be on as well? Isn't that the opportunity that you should be looking for to have an impact with the rest of the City Council?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. It absolutely is.
Oh, okay. So how did it work out then after that night?
Well, that particular example is
Because it's going to
something
be back with us in 7 days.
We've
So
been
that's
working on
gonna
that one for a long, long time.
So will you be here next week?
We will actually be here next week.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Because we'll look to you during that discussion.
Okay, great. No, I mean it's a very the
Don't
city
think I'm
city
joking,
business
Peter.
is extreme.
I'm not joking about that.
Well,
That's
but we will
absolutely-
be here because we
That
have.
is one of the things that there will be a last stand made on that, which is a pathway from
I'm
the
really
Pico
glad to hear
neighbourhood
that.
across the city yards in some form.
That's fantastic. We sent a memo to the Public Works Department in 2010 from planning asking for that
And
exact
you're waiting for the answer,
pathway.
are you?
Yeah, I've been waiting for you to ask that question for 8 years.
And every year I ask it.
You know, since you asked, and I know we don't want to take too long on this, but I will say the college is another partner and resource on this, and we didn't mention this tonight, but we have had a series of discussions with the college. There's some opportunities that are coming up now that they really own the entire block across from the cemetery. Not only will the face of Pico change when their new student services building opens, but we've had some discussions about the property on the corner of 19th and Pico as well. And so I do think that the opportunity to shape and inform some of what's either already on the books or coming is part of what it's incumbent upon us to make happen. So if you keep asking those questions as projects come before you and sort of help us as city staff to work more collaboratively together, that's how we'll make good on the aspiration to be more sort of holistic and integrated about these approaches we take. Because right now it is pretty piecemeal. That is the truth.
My last question to Peter then is, the mobility manager, that's still Francie, is currently up with the Pico Improvement Organisation. Right. So will there be a package about mobility that comes at the same time? We've had on the books for a long time that the Michigan Greenway get enhanced with connections through the industrial areas to the Bergamot station and this way. Will there be a package of other measures which include bike tracks, easy walking area, accessibility that breaks up the whole thing?
I don't think it'll come through this project, but we will be providing the mobility department with the ideas that we've generated through our process, because we hear all kinds of things. The idea sprints that we...
So why wouldn't you ask mobility to produce a package at the same time? Because they've been on this job for a long time. They actually have all the answers. Why wouldn't, when you come back, you have zoning, that, the well-being, social and economic opportunity and mobility wrapped up as a good first step? I mean, I don't understand why we would be waiting.
It's a good comment. It's fair enough. Absolutely.
You're being very generous this evening, Pete. Thank you.
Well, and I mean, I think I can appreciate we understand the desire to bring forward everything at once, but one of the things to recognize, this is the first effort of its kind that the city is undertaking in terms of using well-being, as a lens to look at our neighborhood. So we're really trying new things, and it's a lot of what we're doing is trying to move things forward where we can. And so to you it may seem like small things, but just to get something lifted up like the microgrants, or even to do, I mean, that took a fairly monumental effort on Julia and her team's part to talk about giving people $500 to do something. Mm-hmm. And it's a substantial amount of interdepartmental coordination with all the things that folks are already doing within their departments. And this is not a team that can do everything. It's the core of this team is planning and well-being and the library, and we do have our citywide partnerships, but it's really sort of what we're trying to build here is a foundation towards the community creating these solutions so that it's not government doing everything all at once. And that takes time because that capacity has never existed in this community or potentially even across the whole city. And that was one charge that we looked at when council told us work on this project. It was to be broad and inclusive, and that's taken the months that it has. And I think we've been really pleased in terms of the turnout at these workshops. A lot of the people that showed up wasn't because they got a postcard, it was because they heard about it from their neighbor. And that's the best thing that we could hear, because it means that people are, number one, talking to each other. There's engagement and interest, and the microgrants are one way to build that connectedness and engagement in civic affairs. So, you know, the desire to bring forward packages of things, what we're really trying to do is to make sure that it's a partnership, but, you know, again, that does take time, and, you know, we're trying to bring forward the things that we can do, and there are things that are going to take years. I mean, to be very honest, you know, things like housing policy, where we want to make sure that people are educated and informed first so that we can bring them along on this process. And it's not just us coming up with the 7 big ideas like the way we always do things, because we're trying not very, very specifically and deliberately not do that in this project.
So I thank you for that. I totally understand that new process. Very close focus on one specific geographic, economic and demographic area of the city. But I think the people who raised the issue 5 years ago have probably spent a lot of time waiting for us to do something. And I don't think that what is being asked of, certainly by me this evening, is for a whole revamp of the way your city does business. But Francie, for example, has had a plethora of plans, projects and so on in the works at this exact moment that have been going for some time and being funded. At 17th Street, it's Michigan. I went to a meeting on 20th Street maybe 8 or 9 years ago. We could go on running down. The college has got its mobility programs. Pull that together. Ms. Rusk here has been a high flyer in the city for as long as I've ever been involved, and so she has a series of ideas. And we've heard that you've got an overlay area in the works. I'm simply suggesting that when you come back, it would be great to see a layout of a first cut attempt to deal with the multiplicity of issues that are in this area, and the community would go, wow, these guys have got it. Now that's not housing, and that's not a whole bunch of other things that I know will have a queue of people out the door forever. But it would be a good start, and I think the platform is there. It's how you pull it together from here, and that's kind of my charge to you, Peter. Anyway, thank you.
See what we can do.
So my first thought is just how appreciative I am of this whole process, because I still remember how you all were really looking at me funny when I was coming from social services saying, hey, we have to put these pieces together and we can't do the one without the other. And yes, and you gave me the time of day, which I really appreciate. And now we're seeing this unfold in a way that I think is having been, I think there was a meeting in June, right? Or early July as well, right? I mean, just to see it unfold has been extraordinary, to see the range of people, to see the range of opinions that are being expressed, people who strongly agree with each other, people who strongly disagree with each other, putting their views out in a community context where everyone's a stakeholder. And I really want to commend, first of all, the whole team for that effort, because I know it's new for everyone, and I think the community is stronger for it. So, first of all, kudos. Commissioner McKinnon has said a lot of what I want to say, and I will try not to repeat it. I am very worried that small fixes done without some context will exacerbate commercial gentrification and commercial displacement. I really am. I mean, I live nearby. I see it on a day-to-day basis. I'm seeing old line. What we hear from our local, the businesses that we go to, right, is that the rents are being raised. The commercial rents are being raised speculatively, and then so the rent goes up. The long-standing tenant leaves, and then the landowner goes and looks for someone who's willing to pay that new rent, which leads to some vacancies. But then it also leads to businesses coming in. I mean, I don't want to criticize any one business type or over another business type. That wouldn't be appropriate. But I see very locally serving businesses being replaced by businesses that could just as well be anywhere else in Santa Monica or anywhere else on the west side for that matter. And that really concerns me, and I think it goes back to Julie. I think it goes back to your point in the discussion about how zoning isn't going to do it all, and I think there's a conversation to be had, maybe not in this forum, about the economic development analysis and what tools are available to the city to ensure that this commercial renaissance that we're talking about actually is by and for the people who live in the neighborhood. As opposed to an invitation to speculation in a kind of a rush of a window before the development standards are addressed. So that's one piece of it. And I think, to Jing's point, I don't think, and Commissioner McKinnon, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that we're saying this has to be all done at once, all on one night. But I think there are some pieces where it would be helpful to be clearer, even if the work is done by staff, even if the work is done not here, that when we're being presented with one piece at a time, there's been some pre-work done, and some of these, your known knowns and your known unknowns, and you're able to say, this is the risk you're taking when you're taking this vote, and we've thought about these other things, and here's how we want to mitigate them. Not that we've taken care of it, 100%, but at least it's on our radar. So that leads to the question of circulation. So, for example, what we're talking about here is Pico, as I understand it, that includes the alley south of Pico, right? So that's really our borderline with Sunset Park, right?
Right.
So one of the issues that comes up in terms of the relationship between the boulevard and the R1 neighborhood to its south, east of Cloverfield, is concerns that arise about stuff that's happening in the alley that then lead to different kinds of reactions by neighbors to a whole host of things that have very little to do with what's actually happening in the alley. Mm-hmm. But if we start playing with the uses before we've thought through the impact on the alleys and the circulation concerns and how we're keeping the alleys clear and lit and what's happening there, we could actually create an unintended wave of concern down the line that we don't necessarily, that we could have avoided if we'd thought through some of those circulation issues up front and addressed them up front, which is, again, not that it has to be all trotted out on the dais as we do each piece, but that when we say, okay, have you thought about the alleys? And you say, yeah, we know when we add these particular uses, this is the impact is going to be on the alleys. This is how we're thinking about it. Okay, great. The other piece of that, of course, has to do with bike paths and crossings. If we look at the well-being data that says people want more physical activity, they want more trust, they want more neighborhood connections, it has got to be a lot safer to walk and bike along Pico Boulevard. The kinds of businesses that will want to open on Pico Boulevard will be dependent on that pedestrian and bike traffic, because if we're going to design for a pedestrian street, that's different from designing for a car street. There are a couple of shopping centers that are along Pico. Maybe we don't want to necessarily encourage more of those. I mean, they're fine, but they're really car oriented, and they actually, some of them encourage bad car behavior, because I see it on a daily basis. We heard from Mr. Raskin about what it's like to drive east on Pico, but I mean, trying to get around certain shopping centers at certain hours is very, very difficult. We want to make sure that we're creating opportunities for kids to cross the street safely, families, those pieces, and I think that needs to, at some level, precede the commercial development piece, so that we know what we're planning for, what kind of neighborhood we're planning for. I would love to see. I don't know whether one's been done. Has HED done an economic development analysis of the neighborhood?
What would that look like?
Well, what is the capacity? What is the what would it look like if we're talking about expanding opportunities for small businesses, right? What are the capital needs for those small businesses? What are the capital needs to create a small business of the kind that the folks say they want on the use table? What is the capacity of the neighborhood to generate that capital on its own? What external resources might be needed to provide that capital? How might we do that? That's beyond the purview of this commission as a land use body, but it's not beyond the purview of a Pico well-being project that's trying to create local neighborhood opportunity.
Yeah, that analysis has not been conducted.
Okay. That's something that would be really helpful in order to be able to address this question that Commissioner McKinnon asked. If we create the opportunity, is somebody going to come from outside Santa Monica to pursue it, or are we gonna, or is that opportunity? Are people going to be able to step up to take advantage of that? I remember the conversation. A number of people spoke about the bakeries and the kitchens and the kitchen incubator ideas. I don't know that we can make, it's far beyond what we can do on this dais to actually yield that outcome. That's going to take a much broader effort with a lot with more players.
Yeah.
I do want to say, because council has already directed this, we do in the short term need to make sure we're protecting our rent controlled housing, right? We need to make sure that code enforcement, that enforcement is stepped up, that if rent controlled units are at risk for being chopped up into medium term apartments, like we've heard about other parts of the city. Do we know if it's happening in Pico? What can we do to protect the neighborhood while we're making these decisions? Because it certainly is it's certainly vulnerable. I have lots to say about the city yards, but that's next week. We can talk about that. And I guess the other piece, this goes to procedure. Of the three options, it strikes me that the end game here is a district. That might be the end game. Of the first two options, the overlay district and the, if you can bring up the next slide, the changes to the NC and mixed use boulevard low, which of the two, if we do the work now, which of the two is going to be easier to change or easier going to convert to a district?
If we go with the overlay district, it's easy to lift that off or to replace with a district.
Okay. Because I think what my instinct would be is, if we're going to do this work now, let's do what's easiest to then
undo.
Let's do the work to do step one so that it's then becomes somewhat more straightforward to do step two.
And we kind of look at it in the same way, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
On a procedural basis. My last question is just another suggestion based on a conversation I had with someone over the weekend. It would be I'd be curious to know, and you're focused on commercial issues right now. You mentioned the 40-foot versus the 50-foot. What are the enforcement issues that are coming up, the waiver, variance, modification issues that are being raised? What is the neighborhood trying to do? Actually, not talking about trying to do, but where you actually have local business owners coming to you and saying, we'd like to do this, but we can't. Are there patterns of behavior that you've been able to identify, or when you've gone out to do code enforcement, you have a business owner saying, I'm trying to do the right thing here. You've got a code that's, tying my hands, making me scratch my left ear with my right hand, or whatever it is. Are there ways that we can learn from those interactions on the ground to help us develop the overall?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we get hundreds of calls a day.
Right.
People asking us what they can do. Some people go further down the road only to find out that they've spent money that they can never get back because they've hit some barrier.
Right.
The case study we showed at the last workshop about what was going into the old Angler building is a good example. It was an indoor playground for kids.
Yeah.
Something that clearly the neighborhood said they wanted, but it was the CUP, so it was $20,000, and it needed to create, 36 new parking spaces, which is impossible. So that's the type of lesson that we are learning.
But there's no CUP required for throw pillars.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So that's part of the reason why we want to convert the CUP to P, Pico. We actually have been toying around with the idea of making that a P in all parts of the city, because gym is the new retail. We've heard that a lot. There's hundreds of stories. I don't know them all because I'm not on the phones, but we have people calling about convenience markets, doggy daycare, on and on and on. Pico is a place where people want to be, but there is barriers to access in many cases. I do want to say one thing about your previous comments. I want all those things too, but really what you're talking about is a comprehensive plan, which we have specifically been told not to do. So I think it's a learning process for all of us to figure out ways that we can start to part these things out in a sequence that makes sense for us, that makes us feel comfortable and safe, but still gets things done. Because if we wait for, a bicycle crossing strategy, we could be waiting a whole year just to make a gym a permitted use on Pico Boulevard. If we wanted to find out what the impact or what the resources are required to open a community kitchen, we could be waiting 2 years before we hire a consultant through an RFP process and go through multiple versions. So I think we're just revealing our own internal struggle.
Sure.
Your struggle is our struggle.
Right.
And so we feel like we will come back to you with more sound analysis on some of the potential risks and safety nets for the 14 changes that we may or may not be proposing starting next week. But I just wanted to sort of get on the same page with you about that it's hard for us to sort of work in this way. And thankfully we have really good partners in well-being that are action oriented and are making changes happen on the ground in a way that makes the community feel good about what we're doing.
So I totally appreciate that, and thank you for saying it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess what I would ask is, let's say there are 14, right? Maybe there are. I'm making this up, right? But maybe there are a handful of those. The gym is an interesting example where there was a desire to do it. There's pressure in the neighborhood. There's clearly a local customer base, and the risk of outside speculation is relatively low for that. And so that's a risk that we can take right now. Whereas increasing the width to 50 feet, going from L2 to L17 across the board immediately before we've done other things might be something we want to do in 9 months or in a year.
Right.
I guess my point is let's make sure that we're not accidentally accelerating commercial displacement that we are all seeing by moving to Ps without assessing the risk.
Yes.
Because that's what I worry about.
No,
I worry about the rapid pace of commercial displacement alongside the rapid pace of residential displacement.
And I think when we provide you with the red lines or whatever format these proposed changes take, right now you're operating without the knowledge. You don't know what we're talking about. So when we get there, we'll have a chance to go through each and every single one, and we can kind of do that, and we'll have the background analysis on that. For example, the difference between the 40 feet and the 50 feet affects 22 parcels on Pico Boulevard. So as a percentage of the whole, that's only 13% of this area that's outlined right here. So we do have the numbers. We just haven't gone to that level of detail because we're still operating conceptually here about options for affecting change. Sure.
So I have sort of a follow-on question to yours. What you've used the word displacement, which the first question that comes up, how do you measure that? What does that look like, both for the commercial and the residential? And
for me, displacement is rent going up, forcing a tenant out. Then you have a vacancy waiting for someone coming in to pay the higher rent.
Right.
So that's literally replacing a lower paying tenant with a higher paying one.
Right.
For the purpose at that,
right.
rather than the person voluntarily leaving.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, it's very hard to measure that. That's what. So I don't know if I make this particular chess move, whether we've reduced displacement, we've increased displacement, we've reduced gentrification, or maybe we should think of it in terms of, we'll reduce the rate of displacement. So, but you have to start from something. You have to say, this is a worthy goal. This is important to measure. This is important to wrap our heads around, both commercial and the residential. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Do we have that? Do we have a handle on the rate of displacement is X? It's going up because of the train station. It's going down because of these corrective moves we might make. We're kind of getting into the world of wishful thinking rather quickly.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of data. Yeah, we have a lot of data on Ellis activity and the increase in rents. A lot of the displacement discussion is anecdotal because there are things that aren't documented.
Right.
When people Ellis a building, we know about that. When they buy out a tenant, we often don't. Sure. This also came up during the corporate housing discussion, right? There's a lot of undocumented buyouts that happen. But we have those numbers, and we're happy to. I mean, I can even share a few of them with you right now. Right here, for example, of the 2,800 units that have been Ellised in Santa Monica since the advent of the Ellis Act, 84 of those have been in Pico. So not a super high number compared to Ocean Park. Ocean Park has probably the most, or maybe Wilmot more. But what matters is to the individual person that it's happening to. And in the Pico neighborhood, if you factor in the income, those challenges are perhaps more acute than in other parts of the city. So you have to sort of temper data with anecdote, and we're out there on the ground talking to people that are receiving these letters, and they are living on the edge. So for us, it's real. And displacement is, I'm not saying we're going to solve it, but we're going to try to address it through a variety of different measures, zoning being one, perhaps on the commercial front, development standards being another tool that we have, but we also have the other tools that we've mentioned that are more long-term and are going to take a little bit more of a army to marshal.
Right. Let me ask you, sort of following along those lines, and you put up a series of, let's say, wellness indicators. Maybe there were 3 or 4 that were rather positive, and then there were 5 or 6 that were very difficult, like less English speaking or economic anxiety. They were very specific, I thought. Yeah,
Yep.
That's the thing. Now, are we going to take every initiative? Let's say there's 14 actions we can take. Are we going to look at each one of those and measure it, how it might affect that, might improve it, have no impact at all, or might make it worse?
Well, I think this is a good question for
Julie.
Julie.
Is that a valid matrix to look at in our decision making?
I think it is. We're going to do the third of these indices. We did one in 2015, 2017, and 2019. And for instance, the rate of economic worry between 2015 and 2017 citywide went up by 5%. 20% of the population was very worried about paying rent or mortgage, up to 25%.
I'm surprised it's that low, because
so we'll see what it will be in 2019, and then further we can disaggregate it by zip code to get a little bit more of a granular understanding, and by other factors. So, but your question is then, when you kind of develop an intervention, how do you start to see if that moves the needle? And I think that's the sort of next bit of work that we're really all engaged in as a city now, around this whole question of performance management, what you measure, how you have a theory of change about what it is you're doing, and see where you start and where you follow. So, I mean, the short answer is yes, we can do that. Are we doing that effectively now? I'd say we're at the very beginning of figuring out how to do that, as are many government entities. But this is part of the work that we're all doing together, and I don't know if David or Jing or others want to comment on that, but it's a question of measuring effectiveness and impact is certainly part of what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, the process that every single department in the city is undergoing right now, it's the beginning of a 6-year process to completely overhaul the way that we budget towards a performance management, and Julie's absolutely correct. It is intended to get to a point of getting down to the granular activities that, each department does on a daily basis, how that maps, to certain sub-outcomes and, further like well-being outcomes, and, within this strategic framework that the council has adopted. The council is going to have a retreat on January the 26th to talk about priorities, but this is the first step, very, very small step, and like I said, it is a 6-year process. We are just at the beginning, and it's a very different way, of looking at why we do what we do, how effective do we do it, what the priorities are, and this project is, sort of tied up in that to some degree, because it's a way for us to, when you talk about measuring, we can measure what government does in terms of effectiveness. This is really an index to look at for the community to tell us kind of how their perception, their feeling in some way, because it's a survey, if I'm not mistaken. So it's not like a hard data point, but it is a way to measure and we're still learning about kind of what are the best ways to do that. And, so we don't have all of the answers, right now as to, because I did this, it's going to affect that, because we don't know that for a fact yet.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner McKinnon.
Yes, I have two questions. Ms. Rusk, who are these members of the team that have just joined you, especially the one with the sort of gold head? They seem to be very close to
some
the
of
issues.
the young people of our community are
you really getting to the
part
nub
of
of the issue
families
out
to
there.
understand what their
Family issues
respective
are about.
moms do.
So I think that last answer from Jing actually summed it up. There were some guys here earlier on, and we passed the approval for them to get their restaurant CUP, and they sat there wondering what we'd done till I went down and spoke to them. And so that often happens, and if we go out and do a zoning overlay, people in Pico are going to say, well, what does that matter to us? And so I know that you're taking your first steps, but what would be a really great first step is for you to say that the step that the Council and the Planning Commission and whatever all of this team is doing is in this direction, and it involves some zoning change, which is a zoning code overlay district, some well-being, some economic, some social opportunity, some steps in this direction, and it is a first up attempt. And let people react and talk to you about it, but at least explain why we're headed in a certain direction. Because I think otherwise they'll just go, it's another one of those things that's important to you and to the Planning Commission, but we're all left cold. And we're trying to change an arc and a history, and that's going to be difficult. And so if you could make an attempt at that, that would, I think, be a really useful sort of thing for the people in this neighbourhood to see happen. So perhaps that's the one plea that I would make to you, that whatever you do, we pull it together and present a first package. And it will be a cross-government, cross-council thing, and it will be the first, and maybe it'll show everyone how hard this change is going to be over the next 6 years. But at least it would be a step in the right direction. Otherwise, I think people are going to go, well, I don't really care what 5 feet on a shop front means on 22 properties, 13%. How's that really going to affect me? I've got some mega guy buying out the people next door to me in the neighbourhood, moving in. I'm on $800 a month rent. They're on $3,000. I'm next. That gets to the heart of it.
Okay.
So I'm done. Thank you so much.
So last thought here, and for both Julie and Peter, is there anything you need from us tonight, other than we've had an excellent kind of general discussion? Is there any decision making that's required?
Well,
to
I
keep
think
the
we'd like to
momentum?
leave with a sense of where we should go, because the next step is for us is to really bring forward a series of how is this not working? A series of okay.
Yeah, if I may.
Go for it.
Your agenda item really is for a discussion, so it's not really to take any sort of action.
Okay.
If you'd like to leave some parting thoughts, or perhaps Mr. James has some other questions, but it's not really for formal action.
I guess what I'm saying is there anything that we can do this evening to accelerate or at least keep the momentum in terms of the kind of work plan that you all have in various cross currents? But is there anything that would help you take a big step forward that we can do today?
No, I think we got a lot of good feedback tonight. Some gaps that we didn't see that we need to fill, some connections that we need to strengthen. We've been really focused on the zoning because they were very explicit about that. Everybody was very explicit about that. We've been itching to kind of move on to these other issues. So you've given us you've opened the door to do that. So I think we're good with where we're at.
Okay, Commissioner Landers.
I mean, it sounds like you all are leaning toward the overlay idea, which I mean, I'll speak for myself. I'm saying I'm comfortable with. I hope we are moving in the direction of the district long term. But short term, I think your point that an overlay is immediately visible potentially can have the kind of package that Commissioner McKinnon was talking about and feel tangible to the community, which I think is really important. I do think to reiterate some point, I think we need to put a little more in it than there is now. But I get the limitation. The only other question that I would ask is, a number of us have raised questions that are maybe not best really worked out on the dais of a planning commission. We seem to have working groups for everything. Is there a working group that is either cross commission or cross city that could potentially give us the opportunity to be informed in between meetings, or kind of gather and share information? I'm not sure what your work plan is, but we've asked for a lot that's about putting pieces together that don't necessarily sit exactly here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that is part of both the team's charge and we have the full support of the city manager's office. We have, to work with, like I said, the team is more than you see here. And, although you're bringing up issues about economic development and mobility and housing and what have you, we do have, we feel like we have strong partners that we're working with interdepartmentally. It is a lot of hard work, given the day-to-day demands, right, that are put on everyone. And I think we're also in an age where, not everything can be a number one priority, and we're sensitive to the workload of, things that are going on with our colleagues. That being said, in terms of the collaboration, that is part of the work of this project is, to bring in our partners and to tackle some of the issues that we can do now. And I think that's part of the difference in this, instead of trying to do this all at once and not being and not letting the good be the enemy of doing something for where we can. We have, as Peter said before we started this process, there were about 40 interviews with staff. We did those internal workshops. I think that we have great interest, in staff across the city in sort of plugging into this process, and we're really using it as a opportunity to learn, about what are the different ways that the city can engage our community and educate and inform people about everything that's going on, because there is a ton going on.
Forgive me for belaboring this, but when the invitations go out to the events, I think I've seen, is the Housing Commission invited? Is the Early Childhood Task Force invited? Is the Commission on Disability or the senior community or status of women invited? In other words, I think to Commissioner McKinnon's point earlier again about building a sense in the community, building that sense of momentum and also tangibility. I take the argument that not a work group, but maybe independently of a formal Brown-acted commission meeting, there are one or two opportunities for this kind of cross-fertilization conversation that engages the other commissions or other folks, the task force on the environment. There may be a conversation about trees on Pico. We don't have to have it now, but that kind of thing.
There's definitely room for that. I know that other commissioners have been present at our workshops.
Right.
One thing that we've been very intentional about is this notion of bringing City Hall to Pico. So our June 30th event, we had the mayor MC it. You were there. Greg Moreno was there. A few other folks, notable folks, were there. We held the first ever, planning commission on Pico issues in the Thelma Terry Center a couple months ago. And as we move more into the housing discussion, there's definitely going to be heavy involvement from the Rent Control and the Housing Commission, and I think it'll just flow that way. Our mailings have been broad. We haven't gotten a lot of return on investment on the mailings. As Jing mentioned earlier, most of our folks show up word of mouth. We mail out like 8,000 invitations and we get 100 people. And 50 of those people didn't open the mail. They just came because their neighbors were going, and it was on an issue that's close to their heart. So a point very well taken. We'll definitely continue to involve as many sections of our civic life and our community life as possible.
And I think what you're seeing is this early effort. It has been very deliberate to keep it local, because this project is about the Pico neighborhood, and so we have been deliberate in not necessarily doing things the usual way in terms of using appointed boards and commissions. We have heard that feedback from Pico residents of like, why is that person here? They're not a resident, they're a board, they're city staff, they don't see it any differently, right? And so we have to be really sensitive to that. It doesn't mean that there's not a place for that, but the charge we were given was to be broad and inclusive and to build that foundation. And so that's a lot of the work that you've seen early on, is really being like within the community. And I think there will be a time and a place to bring forth city boards and commissions and that and what have you, but it was deliberate to not start there.
Okay. Hearing no additional questions or comments, I'd like to close this item. So thank you, staff, and thank you, commissioners. Any new agenda items that you would like to have added to the mix sometime in the near future? Hearing none. Going once, going twice. David, you look like you're
not a new agenda item, but I did want to mention something before you adjourned. So
yes,
if now's the time.
Yeah.
So just to remind the commission that tonight is Jing's last meeting. Friday will be her last day, and she will be back in July. She promised. And we, as I mentioned before, Roxanne Tanamori is waiting in the wings to fill in while Jing is gone, so we'll be in good hands. But we just wanted to wish Jing well and acknowledge her last night. So.
Yes, I'm sure everything's going to be great.
I knew it was a downward slide, and once used to be a 24/7, 365 type of person, and then got married to that gentleman, and you were laughing one day in the street. And here where we are now, and you're leaving us, and I mean, really.
Okay, I'd like the motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're closed.